Hornets. The physicist Richard Feynman famously said that there are no ultimate answers, that the fun is in trying to answer the little questions along the way. This story is called Hornets, but it has a subtitle, which is, if you have one of those big questions for the universe, then maybe your little brother can answer it. And most of those big questions do come up at a relatively young age when your little brother tends to be particularly wise. On to the Hornets. I first became acquainted with the animals in the biblical sense, by which I mean I felt the white-hot incandescent flames of their discontent. That fire that stops all time and elevates the present at the expense of everything before and after. That seems to come from neither inside nor outside, from no direction at all. The clear and present fire of the sting. I was about 5 years old and had been commissioned to ascend a bushy scrub oak to retrieve the baseball of the big kids that had somehow gotten lodged in the crook of a branch about 20 feet off the ground. The vines and leaves were so dense and stickery that no big kid could get up the trunk through the thicket. But I had been to the tippy top of every arboreal challenge for 100 yards, and this was my moment. And when I threw the ball down, I received a cheer from big kids who realized I was great and now would revere me for time immemorial, though they did head back to their bases rather quickly. As I was easing myself back down, why is it always on your second or later time through, after you think everything is okay? Do the Hornets give you one or more freebie tickets in the name of fair passage, without telling you that they could slam the channels shut at any time if you come back or retrace? Is there some kind of Vespidian code that will let single violations slide and then enforce seconds or thirds with Tamerlanian brutality? As I was easing myself back down through the thicket, I felt my leg turn to molten lava. My arms were pinned as I looked down, and I could see the two vibrating beasts inserting voltage into the top of my suntanned leg. I had two thoughts. One, how could only two cause so much lightning? And two, how fortunate I was that there were only two. Felt like there were 1,000. Try to swat them. Don't try to brush them off. Just take it and faint and fall. That's what I did. I rolled down through the vines into the weeds below, and the savages were removed. There was a kid even smaller than me under the tree who thought that my fall was the funniest thing he had ever seen. I joined him in genuine laughter myself, but I wasn't laughing at the Charlie Chaplin fall. I was laughing at the miracle that the Hornets hadn't followed me down. I can still point to the exact spots on my leg where those monsters had hooked themselves up. Little kids aren't much hurt when they fall out of trees. The big kids didn't see me fall and wouldn't have cared if they had. But those two Hornets were big kid stuff, and I knew that I had been a part of a force that was larger than all of us. Later in life, when I was about 20, there came my third Hornet lesson. My second will be related later. It was the second part that allowed me to survive the third. In the current part 3, I had been no-handsing it up a steep extension ladder to the second-story roof of a country house I was fixing up, with various rolls of sheet aluminum and flanging for a chimney I was putting in for a first-floor Franklin stove. This was my first house back in that fix-em-up stage, and I was darn proud of it. I must have thrashed through the branches of a big old maple tree maybe 30, 40 times before coming down for, I think, pretty much the finish. Maybe that's it. The Vespidian Code allows you to trespass, no worries, right up until the last time you're going to pass. Then they let you know who was really in control the whole time. I felt my elbow hit something that felt like a canvas water bag hidden in the leaves. It wasn't a water bag. And how I hadn't jostled it or noticed it before seemed impossible, given how close it was to the ladder. I could easily have hit it many times already. Of course, I was dancing forwards down the ladder, still with no hands. They were on me instantly, 20 or 30 of them. I was still 12 feet off the ground, and I realized that if I jumped and broke my leg, they would sting me into a screaming puddle of pain and death. So I firmly but slowly descended in a measured, adult manner and took another 20 or 30 shots. I can tell you that I felt every one of them, and that every single one of them was worse than the one right before it. But I didn't jump. I slow walked it to the ground and ran. I called my buddy who was pre-med, and he said to take a Benadryl. I took 2. And then I went down to the frigid shore of Lake Cayuga and lay in the shallows for a half hour and waited for sanity to return. Later, I took my revenge with a hose and 2 cans of Raid, shooting them down with a holy righteousness far beyond anything experienced by today's youth clicking their weaponized video games. The youth are right about one thing. When it comes down to it, it's a Hobbesian world. And there are times when it is more than okay to relish it that way. Civilization has not come this far to give up our native rights without a fight. That's the other side of the Feynman Weltanschauung. Force and strategy win, carefree, no matter how industrious, loses. There was at least one vestigial philosophical update to this part of the story. A full month later, long after I was certain there was no trace of the hive remaining, I went up the ladder to check the chimney, which, by the way, had a 34-foot suction draw on it that could pull small sticks halfway up to the second floor. That's always the risk with a new chimney. Will it draw? I glanced to the limb where the nest had been, which I automatically did every time I went up, and I saw a single seething hornet watching me with unmitigated hatred. I later learned that some scouts return after long missions flying afield. This one had returned to conclude correctly that I was the agent of his only home's destruction. Not that it wasn't justified. And there I was. He bombed towards me and stung me on the shoulder about as bad as I have ever been stung. And when I batted him off, he spit at me and took off toward the woods with a buzzing of his wings, which sounded like a small-scale version of maniacal operatic laughter. There is a lesson there somewhere. Maybe it's simply, as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. At least, I hope that's what the lesson said. Part 2 of my Hornet Odyssey. The part that is going to supply insight into how I survived Part 3. In Part 2, I was about 9, and that was when the hidden power of the concealed nest was first underlined. Why do they blend in an ominous ovoid shape that is bigger than a football? Why do the Hornets not claim a territory with the guard tower of menace like at a high-security prison? Why the chameleon-like concealment? Greenish in the leaves, brickish on the side of a garage. Do they have themselves some sort of enemy higher up in the chain? Some sort of flying honey bears in their evolutionary past? Are Hornets assigned as enforcers here on Earth to let you know that sometimes you can pass in thoughtless freedom, but you must learn that that is not always going to be the case? But do those enforcers themselves have enemies who keep them in line with a yet higher code of governing power? Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who guards the guards? Maybe I should have obeyed my Uncle Ted's encouragement and gone into philosophy after all. Okay, part 2. I was showing my little brother this great fishing hole I had found. I didn't have my tackle with me when I found it, but I could see the fish milling around among the lily pads. This was going to be the best fishing hole not yet known to mankind. We were on a narrow trail along the steep edge of an arm of the lake on my granddad's farm property in eastern PA. The area was extremely swampy with all manner of sedge tussocks to jump to and from, and puddles and mud pits to avoid. At one point, the path rose up high with a deep water cliff on one side and what looked like a quicksand bog on the other. That bog was obviously occupied snout to snout by a myriad of slimy creatures with, as the golf announcer Gary McCord used to say about the inhabitants of similar areas where a certain kind of shanked ball ends up, no shoulders. There was a thick clot of blueberry and birch crowning the peak elevation of the narrow trail, such that you had to tussle with the limbs and leaves to get past. I had thrashed my way through the day before at considerable trouble, but I knew it could be done, even carrying our rods and worm cans. I was in the lead, of course, and my brother following, and while wrestling with my balance up there, I felt the unmistakably familiar fire on my shirtless back. I shrieked and dropped my tackle and ran forward through the bush and away from the house. I knew it was going to hurt bad, maybe 5 stings. The hornets were up and buzzing over the bush in a cloud, about 1,000 of them. This kind of hornet was more social than the previous baseball tree hornet. Social as in Army, social as in Air Force. My brother took that all in and gave a shriek much like my own and turned and rabbited back down the path toward the road, his own shirtless back flickering as he jumped through the puddles and sedges that we had previously crossed. He wasn't stung, but he was scared bad. I couldn't blame him for running. I myself gave up on retrieving my tackle for the moment and retreated onward toward the future miraculous fishing spot, which was right ahead. But I knew that past there was nothing. Nothing but more and more deep and wild, even dangerous swamp and wilderness, leading further and further back from the road. I looked back at the buzzing mass above the thick bush on the narrow path. I was still feeling the lightning bolts on my back. I was trapped. There was no way to get back without being stung to death. I yelled at my brother in the distance. He was running for home, barefoot, out on the farm road. I could see him through a chink in the intervening branches and leaves. And that's when I wanted to answer the big question. I wailed, "What am I supposed to do?" As my brother was almost out of range, I can still hear his high-pitched, heartfelt answer, delivered without turning his head back towards me. He yelled back, "I don't know." That was it. That was my little brother's answer to the big question. That's the answer to a lot of big questions. That's what philosophy needs to realize. So now what? Barefoot and shirtless with the wilderness ahead and the hornets behind. My back stinging like I had been machine gunned. My tackle and bait were under the bush, so I couldn't have survived on the fish I caught if I had to survive in the wilderness. That's how we thought in those days. That spot was so remote that it might have taken the adults quite a while to show, though my brother could have showed them where to start. He would have showed them, wouldn't he? Turns out that wasn't necessary. Here's what I did. Hint: it involves statistical calculation, inductive reasoning regarding the gross geographical features of the area, memories of overheard conversations among adults, and, I can only speak the truth, outright bravery on my part. That's the real answer to the big question. I know it now, and I knew it then. Oh, and I did ultimately go into applied math, not a philosophy. And that is the key to my wisdom and my escape. I'm not going to tell you exactly how I did it. Everybody has to chart their own path. Suffice it to say, it involved a pair of flexible saplings along with calculations not unknown to medieval castle wall catapulters. A log, some vines, and some rafting techniques that would have made Huck and Jim proud. If you want to know more, I merely refer you to an old Bruce McCall painting depicting a princely and well-muscled high diver arching outward and up from the ledge of a 40-story building as a distant but steadily piloted vintage aircraft cycles onto the apparent path of a future splashing intersection far below. Fixed atop the aircraft is a swimming pool of generous width, though to my eye somewhat parsimonious depth. It's a still life, but it is full of carefully calculated motions to come. That visual, plus the presence of a whitewater recent flood-fed stream into the lake not too far away, should give you enough clues for you to extricate yourself should you ever find yourself in a similar situation. Those details, and of course the aforementioned raw courage. As Feynman said, the fun is in the journey. All right, I'll tell you how I did it. You're probably not going to believe it anyway. First off, if you've ever read the Robert Frost poem Birches, you know that by the time they are 10 or so, country boys are able to climb to the top of rather tall young trees of certain flexible stock. Aspens and particularly hickories are even better than birches, and launch themselves with legs nearly vertical at first and ride down to the ground a fair ways away from where the trunk is planted, as much as 20 or even 30 feet in the case of hickory that's 4 or 5 inches across at the base. In the current case, there were 2 excellent, tall, thin hickory saplings reaching together for sunlight on the high bank of the flooding stream. I lashed the 2 tops together with vines. All true fishermen carry a pocket knife. And I aimed, launched, and lowered myself over the edge of the rock face and down into the stream, where there was stuck a broken off leafy branch from a big oak further back up the mountain. I managed to dislodge the branch and rode it down the spillway into the lake, and after paddling in the current for a few yards, I left it and swam past the hornet bush high up on the top of the bank and hauled myself back onto the trail closer to the road, home free. You might be able to see how, 10 years later, I was able to assess the latter escape so coldly and determine the unhurried and costly descent that was necessary. I had already been trained by trial by fire. My brother showed a slightly forced lack of surprise when I walked through the yard back at the house. He still hadn't told anybody. In fact, so as to preserve our ability to fish in future dicey places without supervision, neither one of us ever told anybody. We never did make it to that fishing hole. But I did go back early the next morning when it was cold and bellied under the bush enough to grab my fishing rod and withdraw. I saw that our bait bucket had rolled down the bank into the mud below, and the worms had returned to the wild.